I was just informed that Assemblymember Hagman just arrived at the airport. I guess his plane was a little bit late, so he'll be joining us probably within half an hour or so. Anyway, welcome. This is the first meeting of the subcommittee that has been charged with taking a look at the program itself and making any recommendations to the board and to the legislature regarding any changes or modifications we'd like to see in the program moving forward as we put the 2014 bond on the ballot. And what I asked that we do at our first meeting is have an overview of the current program so that all of us have a deeper understanding of where our money goes now, what the regulations are and the guidelines that we follow. And then I'd like to have we'll take public comment, and then I'd like to have member discussion here on, particular areas that they'd like us to drill down in deeper in future meetings. So with that, Lisa, do you want to begin?
Yes, good morning. Definitely want to take advantage of this opportunity to be here at early morning. Before we get started, let's say go Giants.
Yeah, that's right. I'm wearing my Good Luck Giants clothes here.
So we're going to walk through a few items today, and again, just give a general overview of the program as you outlined, and we'll be handing off to various members here. Juan will also cover a portion of the program along with Barbara Kampminer and Tracy Sharp. So let's get started. Again, the board actually set up this program subcommittee at the last state allocation board meeting, and again, the goal was to look at the program in its entirety and see what advantages or opportunities we have to make some improvements or recommend some improvements potentially for a future program. So back in 1998, the Green Act actually was a catalyst for setting up the program under Proposition 1A, and that actually changed the program dramatically. The prior program had a lot of state controls in place, and that was the lease purchase program. But the new program was basically designed and actually created some caveats. It was going to create a matching basis for the program. It actually set up the formula for pupil grants. It actually provided opportunities for supplemental grants and additional site grants and other specific cost-related grants as a basis for some of the funding. With that, it actually provided a lot of flexibility. The districts actually controlled the scope of the project, and again, the goal was to have less oversight from the state. Some of the requirements actually did move forward, actually required a couple of different approvals. We had the Division of State Architect, who actually had to provide an approval of the project, and to ensure that it met the Field Act requirements and other requirements as outlined in law. And the Department of Education also had its requirements as well, the requirements related to the site approvals and the educational adequacy. The changes in the program, again, really focused on a lot of different structure. One of the catalysts that they emphasize is the full and final apportionment. So they mean all state grants were final. Additionally, if a district actually had achieved some unanticipated savings, those savings were actually kept with the district, and with that, they could also spend those money on high priority capital outlay. With the maturity of the program, again, Proposition 1.8 set out, there's very few programs in the first bond initiative. It covered new construction, modernization, hardship, and it also covered class size reduction. So there was, the premise of the program at that time was only 4 programs that was covered. But as it started to mature under Proposition 47, again, more programs were actually included, and that also included the charter schools and the joint use program. There was actually some set-aside money for new construction and modernization, and that really focused on, at that time, the board had created an unfunded list. So the bond actually did grandfather in some funds to incorporate those projects. And under Proposition 55, again, adding some more programs, again, they added the critically overcrowded schools. The premise of the program still remained the same: monies to new construction and modernization, and additional funds for charter schools and joint use. And the last bond initiative was Proposition 1D, and it actually added a few more boutique programs to it. And we have the Overcrowded Relief Grant Program, again, the basis of new construction, modernization, a career tech educational program, more funds to the joint use, and we actually have a carve-out also in the new construction for the seismic program. One of the changes, significant changes in the program as it was maturing really occurred during the Proposition 47 phase. The basis of the program for the modernization grant was an 80-20, meaning the state committed 80-20, 80% of the funds, and the district matched 20%. But that did change to a 60-40 match. And so, again, the state's share changed to 60% for the mod program, and the district share was 40% at that time. If I could draw your attention just to a pie chart on page 3. So the school facility program over the last 14 years, again, it just provides you a display there. $35.4 billion have been allocated to the program. And if I can direct your attention to page 4, I did highlight some of the bond initiatives and how the program has matured and added additional programs. Again, Proposition 1A did provide $6.7 billion. Proposition 47, $11.4 billion. Proposition 55, $10 billion, excuse me, and Proposition 1D, $7.3 billion. And we've been providing the board, obviously, regular updates. We still have some money in the current program under the seismic program. There's still funds in the various categories in Proposition 55, and a little bit in Proposition 47 for new construction and modernization. And so with that, I would turn it over to Juan so he can give you a basis of how the application is processed.
So the typical process involves two major steps. The first one is districts have to qualify, meaning that they have to determine that there is eligibility for each of the programs. Districts can apply for eligibility before or at the same time as funding. Staff reviews that eligibility, takes it to the board for approval, and then after that they generally go out and get the plans approved by the different agencies. In this particular case, the two major ones, as Ms. Silverman mentioned, is the Department of Education and the Division of State Architect. Once those plans have been approved, then they can submit a funding application, and then we do another review, which then gets also submitted for board approval. After the board approves it, then they can request funding in terms of fund release. Once the funds have been released, then there's different expenditure reports that the districts have to submit until the closeout is performed. That is a very basic, general, high level of how the program works. But before we get into the mechanics of how each of them work, we wanted to give you a very high-level overview of each of the programs and put them side by side so you can see the differences between each. This is found on page 6 on tab 2. I'm going to go over the two bigger programs. So on this matrix you see the first one is new construction. And again, there's two basic components, and we're going to get into each of these for each program, which is eligibility and funding. For new construction, just to give an example, the eligibility is determined on a district-wide basis, and it is basically to create funding for unhoused pupils. Districts can build classrooms to create seats for these unhoused pupils. It could be adding a couple of classrooms to an existing site, or it can be building a completely new school. Now the actual funding is based on a per pupil formula, which again we'll get into detail a little bit later. And in addition to the per pupil grant amounts, there's also supplemental grants that they can qualify for. Now generally speaking, there's a local match requirement, but under this program, districts can apply and qualify for financial hardship, in which case they can receive up to 100% state financing for the eligible cost. The second one is modernization. This one's a little different.
Wait, actually, new construction, you can either do it on a district-wide or high school attendance area,
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
Yeah, so large school districts, yeah.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Thank you, yes. Modernization is site-specific, and it's basically based on the age of the buildings. If you have older buildings, which in this particular case means buildings that are 20 years or older, you can qualify for modernization eligibility. The funding formula is very similar to new construction in terms of providing a per pupil grant amount plus any eligible supplemental grants, and it also allows for the financial hardship aspect for districts that qualify for funding. Now this one is on a 60% state, 40% district basis. So that is the basic high-level comparison, again, in terms of eligibility and funding and whether there is financial hardship available for those programs. I do want to highlight that we have a correction under the joint use. We have stated that the financial hardship is available for joint use. It is currently not available. So it is available on a 50-50 basis. And then another thing I want to highlight is just the Career Technical Educational Program and the Charter School Facilities Program. They do not have financial hardship available, but they can apply for a loan. So again, this is a very high-level overview, a side-by-side of each of the programs. We're going to get into the mechanics, the details of how each of those work. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ms. Kampmeinert.
So the next, the first program we'd like to start with in detail is the new construction program. This is one of the core programs of the SFP. So I'm going to begin on page 7, which is behind tab 3. And then our plan from here is to walk you through each of the individual programs and answer any questions that you may have. Juan mentioned some of the components of the new construction program, but again, this is to add classroom capacity to meet future student housing needs. So if you look at our graphics here, we've got an overcrowded classroom where we don't have any place to put the kids. So how does a district plan for that? Well, under the SFP new construction program, districts take a look at their future enrollment needs, and they project those needs either on a 5 or a 10-year basis and compare that to the existing capacity that the district has available to house the students. The difference between the projection of enrollment and the existing capacity becomes new construction eligibility. So if you look down at the bottom of the page 7 there, we've got some happy children in these little classrooms. We have seating for 27 pupils right now. Well, in 5 years, there are 6 kids that are not going to be able to get into that classroom because it's full. So the eligibility under the program would be to house 6 students. Now that's obviously a very basic example. These numbers are much higher in real life. The projection of the enrollment uses what's commonly referred to as the cohort formula, and it takes the historical enrollment data from the past 5 or 10 years. Now, that's not the only thing a district can use when projecting that. We have cases where there is a new development that's going in, and that also needs to be accounted for. So to supplement the enrollment, a district can look at the dwelling units that are going in the district's area and augment the enrollment projection with those dwelling units. And that's to allow for adequate planning for the future so that the facilities can be built before the students actually arrive. Now, new construction grants can be used to build entirely new schools, or they can be used to add classroom capacity to an existing school site. The grant is intended to pay for the construction costs of the classrooms as well as things like core facilities, multi-purpose rooms, gymnasiums, administrative facilities, things that would go along with the new school project as well. Now, when the school facility program looks at how many students should be in a classroom, on page 8 we've got a chart here of how the classrooms are loaded, and it's determined by grade level. So for a K-6 classroom, the state would expect 25 students in each classroom, and then for 7 to 12, it's 27 students per classroom, and then the loading standards are adjusted for non-severe and severe students as well because there's more space needs there. And as was mentioned, the eligibility can be determined either on a district-wide or an attendance area basis. We have a very basic attendance area shown on page 8. So basically, this box sort of in the bottom third of the page would represent the entire district. Now, we've got it broken into 4 different attendance areas. So where this comes into play is if there's one area of the district that's experiencing tremendous growth, they may have a need for new facilities over there, while maybe the attendance area 4 perhaps is the older part of town. Maybe it's not experiencing any sort of growth. It's a more established area, and maybe you don't have a lot of children there. So rather than factoring that into the district-wide eligibility, which may never give you a need for any additional capacity, if you break it into the attendance areas, you could generate eligibility in one of the areas but not the other. So that addresses the needs within the district when the demographics are vastly different. New construction eligibility for the program does expire every year, so this is something that the district needs to update with current information either at the same time as submitting the funding application or on an annual basis in advance of the funding application. And this is done because it's a moving target. It's a projection, so it might change. Things shift in the district, so the eligibility is only good for 1 year. For small school districts, this can be locked in for 3 years because the changes in a small school district can have a larger impact, and a couple students leaving 1 year could have a great impact on the projections. So for small school districts, there currently is a lock available, 3-year lock, so that they can plan for their projects without fearing that the eligibility is going to disappear 1 year and then return the next. So once a district has determined eligibility, then they can come in and apply for funding. So I'm moving over to page 9. The funding process is done on a per pupil grant basis, and the new construction program does provide funds on a 50-50 state and local sharing basis. The per pupil grant amounts, we've listed them for the current year down at the bottom of the page. So for the K-6 grade level, for each pupil grant of eligibility that a district has, that base grant amount is worth $9,455 at the K-6 level, and it increases from there for 7, 8, 9, 12, and then severe and non-severe. Now these grants do change every year in keeping with the Class B construction cost index, and they're adjusted by the State Allocation Board typically around the beginning of the year, around January. And there are a couple other things to highlight on this program. Right now on the funding process, the construction costs, either the estimated or the actual construction cost, must be greater than or equal to 60% of the state share of the state grant plus the district's matching share. So it's the 60% commensurate requirement. And then the other thing is that a district must submit the funding application prior to occupying the new facility. So it can be done well in advance, but the last point to submit for that funding is the date when the building is occupied. Let's see. And then the funding formula is shown on page 10. The basic funding formula is the pupil grant requested times the per pupil grant amount, and that equals your base grant. However, there are supplemental grants that can be added onto the project. Once you add the base grant and the supplemental grants, you get the total state share at 50%, and then you double that and you get the 100% total project cost. And on page 11, we have an example of what that actually looks like, and Tracy Sharp is going to walk through that example for you.
So we have an example here of a new construction project for you. And you're probably familiar with seeing these in the consent agenda. Is the microphone working?
No.
Oh, there it is. I got it. Thank you. I pressed that button a little harder. Anyway, we wanted to show an example of how we get to these various grants that are listed on the funding items that you would typically see in the consent agenda each month listed on there. It breaks out and basically shows you the formula. Now, I will also start with letting you know that this particular example is an extreme example in some respects. We have a new construction project that is 20 classrooms at the K-6 grade level that, based on the loading standard, would be 500 pupil grants. But we've also made another assumption about this site in that it's only 2 acres, which is quite small. But the purpose for doing that is to be able to show as many supplemental grants that might apply to an application to give a flavor for how they're calculated. So we start with the basic base grant. You take your number of pupils per classroom and 20 classrooms, and you get your base grant there. The current 2012 K-6 grant amount is $9,455. And then the next two grants are for fire code requirements. These supplemental grants were the result of SB 575 and basically added new requirements. And so the supplemental grant here is to provide funding to help districts meet those new requirements in law. There's a supplemental grant for multi-level construction. This project assumes that all the classrooms are multi-level, and so the district would get an additional 12% of the base grant added on for every pupil housed in a multi-level building. Project assistance is added. This would be for a small district, less than 2,500 pupils. These grant amounts, I should mention, are established with that annual cost of construction index that the board considers each year, as Barbara said, approximately in January. So that's where some of these rates are coming from, and this project assistance is adjusted each year with that.
And what's the intent of the project assistance to cover which costs?
It would assist districts in the cost of completing applications and preparing all the documents necessary to establish their eligibility and funding applications. And then we move on to the next four that starts with site acquisition, relocation cost, the 2% amount, and DTSC fees. And so under new construction, a district can get 50% of the lesser of either the appraised value or the actual value. In this case, we've basically said the appraised value and the actual value is $5 million, so they're getting a 50% amount of that. We're throwing in some relocation costs if this site went through a condemnation proceeding and potentially a business had to be relocated. They can get additional grants for those costs. The 2% amount is actually 2% of the value of the site, and this is to assist with the appraisal, escrow, survey, site testing. And DTSC fees. The districts are required to have their site reviewed by Department of Toxic Substance Control, so there's a grant here, a supplemental grant to cover those costs. And if there were any hazardous waste removal needs on this site, 50% of those costs. And then we get into the next three, which are commonly called site development as a group, to cover the costs of preparing the site, adding curbs and gutters, landscaping, and utilities. And then we move on to general site that's offered for new acreage, and that's to cover more things inside the site, walkways, hard landscaping, sports fields. That's okay. This formula is a three-step formula for general site. So once I'm done going over all of these, we'll flip to the next page and we'll be able to see how exactly that is calculated. We've also added a high performance incentive grant on this project. It garnered 34 points through the process and got an additional $339,000 for that. And then depending on its geographic location in the SFP regs, there's a chart that defines what areas within the state can get an additional percentage bump, anywhere from 5 to 50%, depending on location, for cost factors based on their location. And the urban security impacted site, this grant is based partially on the size of the site. We rely on the Department of Education plan approval and site approval letters to get the recommended site size and for it. And if the site is 60% or less of the CDE recommended site size and the value per acre is $750,000 or more, they can qualify for this grant. And then there's the prevailing wage monitoring grant, which if your construction contract award is after January 1st, 2012, the project would be subject to monitoring by the Department of Industrial Relations, and an additional grant is provided for that. So that's how a basic overview of these grants and how they are calculated. If we want to flip to the next page, page 12, we have the specific steps and the calculation for the general site, high performance, and urban security impacted site grant. They're a little more complicated than just a basic percentage increase. There's multiple steps. So we have spelled those out for you. Any questions about that?
I have just one quick question. Does the 60% apply to all the items here related to construction or just the base grant?
The 60% commensurate test,
Yes.
it applies to all. We would, sorry, I need to qualify that. We would exclude site acquisition,
Right.
and I believe it's LCP and prevailing wage grant are excluded from that calculation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If we're ready, we'll move on to the modernization grant or the program. Okay, so for the modernization program, as noted, funding was provided in Propositions 1A, 4755, and 1D. The intent is to extend the useful life of the facilities and enhance the physical environment of the school. This is a very broad description, and districts have a lot of choice when it comes to how they're going to use their modernization grants. Typical projects include structural upgrades, excuse me, accessibility improvements on the site, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, technology, roof replacement, and on from there. Those are just some of the bigger, more typical things that we've included. In addition, under modernization, a district could elect to demolish a facility and replace it using their mod funding. Similar to the new construction program, funding is provided on a per pupil grant basis that is adjusted each year by the board, as mentioned earlier. And if the buildings on the site are 50 years or older, they will get a higher grant amount. So that's part of the program. And as well, they can get additional grants for upgrading the utilities when it's for 50-year-old buildings or older. So eligibility, we'll start into that now. Each school site has its own separate eligibility. It's site-specific, and districts can choose to establish each site at will. It doesn't have to be the whole district all at once. The main eligibility factors are the age of the building. Permanent buildings are 25 years or older are eligible. Portable buildings, 20 years or older. And the second factor is the site enrollment by grade level at the time. So when a district comes in and we look at what's on the site right now that day, when they establish their eligibility, we commonly call that their snapshot. What does it look like today? And that's your snapshot moving forward that stands. So districts have two choices when developing or establishing their eligibility. We commonly call it option A or option B. It can be on your classroom count, or it can be a ratio that is square footage comparison or number of classrooms. Districts aren't locked in. They can establish at one and change it over time as it benefits them. So it's up to them to choose that. They're not required to update their eligibility, as with new construction, such that it doesn't have to decrease if their enrollment at the site decreased. And just I'll walk into some examples here of the eligibility calculation, starting with classroom count. So we would look at the number of eligible classrooms on the site, and by eligible I mean of age. They're at least 20 or 25 years old. Multiply that by the pupil loading standard for the grade level. So for K6, that'd be 25. And that would give you your maximum number of pupil grants. Now we're also going to compare that number of pupil grants to your CBEDS enrollment at the site for that year, and it's the lesser of the two. So in our example here, for a K6 school that has 6 eligible classrooms, multiplied by 25 gives potentially 150 eligible pupil grants, which would become the baseline, and that's the maximum that they could gain there at that site. Now, if we turn the page to page 14, I will walk through the second option for eligibility, and this is the ratio option, based on either classrooms or square footage. So in our example, we have on this particular site, step one would be to look at how many eligible square feet do you have. In this case, we're showing 2,000. The total square footage on the site is 4,000. Divide 2,000 by 4,000, you get your ratio of 0.5. Step two is to take then your pupil grants, if there are for the for K6, 100 of them, if there's times 0.5, and the result is 50 K6 pupil grants on the baseline for that. Now you can also apply this in classroom count. So if it was 4 total classrooms on the site and 2 of them were of age, the same methodology would apply for figuring out the ratio. And now we'll move on to funding. Modernization program provides funding on a 60-40 basis. As mentioned earlier, it's based on the per pupil grant amount, which is then your base grant. Districts say we had a baseline eligibility of 50 pupil grants. A district could use all those 50. And when the pupil grant amount is based on the year that they submit their application. And the actual amounts for 2012 are listed here for each grade level. We have not included the 50-year-old building rate, but that would be higher for them. And then the funding formula is very similar to new construction. Pupil grants requested times the per pupil grant amount is your base grant. And your base grant plus any supplemental grants will give you your total state share. I would like to make a correction there on step 3. That should be state share 60%, district share 40%. That shouldn't be 50-50. And then we have an example on page 15, similar to the one provided on a new construction, a potential modernization project and how the supplemental grants work. So if we had a project that requested 200 pupil grants for a modernization project at a K6 school, you'll see some of the same supplemental grants that could apply. In this case, we have our base grant. The current rate, 3,600 times 200, gives you your base grant. A per pupil amount for the fire detection and alarm system. In this case, if it were a district with less than 2,500 pupils total enrollment, they would qualify for project assistance. If they qualified for the high performance grant with 34 points, have their total grant here. Geographic location. And an additional one, small size project. Since this project is 200 pupil grants or less, they are getting a 4% increase. If it were 101 or less, it would get a 12% increase on it. And that's to meet economies of scale for smaller size projects, to provide an additional grant for that. And then for modernization, districts can also get an additional grant for their requirements to improve accessibility on the site and to meet current fire codes. In this case, we're showing the 3% of the base grant increase. Districts may also itemize out the specific costs, and there's a 60% option for this. So they have 2 ways of going, a flat rate or a more detailed cost layout. We've also shown the grant for a project that might be multi-level and requires an elevator to be installed. So there's an additional grant for that. We've already gone over the urban security grant, which is available to modernization projects as well, and the prevailing wage monitoring grant if the construction contract was awarded after January 1st of this year. And once again, we have on the next page spelled out the steps for those more complicated multi-step supplemental grants, being the High Performance Incentive Grant and the Urban Security Impacted Site Grant. For your additional information, on pages 17 through 21, we have a listing of all the various supplemental grants that a district could get. We weren't able to include all of them in the examples we provided, but as many as possible. Just gives you some background as to what districts, what the grant is for, and how it's calculated. Any questions on any of that?
Is the high performance grant different for modernization than new construction, or is it the same calculation and the same way to calculate points?
It's slightly different. The scales are different. And we will get into that a little bit more when we go into the high performance, but
Thank you.
it changes slightly. And then for your reference as well, on page 22, we have a matrix of the programs across the top and the various supplemental grants down the side, so you can get an overview by program of which supplemental grants could apply to each program. I will turn it over to Barbara to continue on with the critically overcrowded schools program, if there are no other questions.
So now we've covered the two main components of the school facility program, but that only covers a portion of the programs that are actually available to districts under this umbrella program. So the next step is we'll go through some of the more specialized programs that districts have had an opportunity to take advantage of in the past or are currently participating in. And we're going to begin on page 23 with the critically overcrowded schools program. And before I get into that, I would like to say that authority within this program is exhausted. There is currently no provision for any future funding. And the bond sources for this program were Proposition 47 and 55. We did not see this program continued on in Proposition 1D. But the critically overcrowded schools program provided funding equivalent to new construction funding to relieve overcrowding at school sites with a high pupil density. This program allowed for the construction both of new schools or additions to existing school sites. The application structure in this program was a little bit unique under the school facility program in that a district did not have to be ready to go with DSA approved plans and CDE approved plans in order to submit an application for funding. They could come in for what was called a preliminary apportionment. You'll hear that term both in the critically overcrowded schools program and in the charter schools facility program. A preliminary apportionment is basically a reservation of bond authority based on an estimated project. Districts would determine what they thought they wanted to do under the program and make a request for the preliminary apportionment, and they then had a 4-year time frame with a possible 1-year extension to go ahead and get that project to a final apportionment stage. And a final apportionment looks much like a regular new construction modernization type application where the plans have been designed, they've gone through all the processes through CDE, DSA, DTSC, any other agency that needed to be involved, and they're ready to go forward and receive funds from the State Allocation Board. So it gave districts a little bit of an opportunity to go ahead and plan and get things moving, knowing that the bond authority was there and reserved for them. The eligibility under the critically overcrowded schools program was also a little bit different than for a regular new construction project. Eligibility was checked at both the preliminary apportionment stage and the final apportionment stage. Eligibility could be based on several things, and this changed as the program evolved, but districts could use just the typical cohort projection that we discussed in new construction. Districts could use current enrollment. They could use current residency or a projection of residency data when justifying the need for the project. The other factors for eligibility, the school that the pupils were being drawn from that was considered overcrowded needed to be identified as a qualifying school site, and CDE kept a source school list for districts, so it was, if you were on that list, you were eligible to participate. Qualifying sites were based on a site density, and also the source schools drove the new projects, so when you were planning your project, you needed to be within a certain distance of the source school so that you were actually relieving overcrowding. So you couldn't have a source school here and then 10 miles away build your new elementary school and expect that to relieve overcrowding at the school that generated the eligibility. So there was a certain radius, a 1 to 3 mile radius, depending on the grade level of the students that you could draw your project from. So the funding for the critically overcrowded schools program, once it got to the stage of a final apportionment, basically followed the same path as a regular new construction application. So the main difference here was the application structure and how you generated eligibility for the program, but then it switched over to pupil grants in effect at the time. Supplemental grants were allowed, as was site acquisition, the costs associated with site acquisition, things like that. And let's see. Also, this was a 50-50 program because it was a new construction type program. And let's see. There was a reserve account of 15% that was set aside so that when projects converted over to final apportionment, there may have been some funds there to account for unknown cost. Any of the funds that were not used for final apportionments reverted back to the new construction account at the end of the program, and that's what the board has done. A year, a little more than maybe a year or 2 years ago, is all the funds that were in the COS program that were not used for final apportionments were moved back into the new construction account. So I think that's that program. Any questions on that program before we move to the overcrowded relief grant program? Okay. So moving on to page 25. The Overcrowding Relief Grant Program, it's the opposite of COS. It was not in Propositions 47 and 55. This program was created and funded through Proposition 1D. And this program also addressed overcrowded school sites, though in a slightly different way. The Overcrowding Relief Grant Program replaces portable classrooms with permanent classrooms on overcrowded sites. Now, some of the requirements in this program are that the project must increase the usable outdoor space, and that would include things such as play areas, green spaces, outdoor lunch areas. So if you can imagine a school site where a district has had to take portable classrooms and drop them on the athletic fields or on the blacktop on the basketball courts. So the problem here was that there are schools where you have classrooms, but the whole campus has portables on it, so the kids have nowhere to have a proper PE program or to play or eat lunch. So the concept behind it is that this program would allow you to get rid of those portables and either reconfigure your existing school site, possibly into a multi-story configuration so that you can free up some of the outdoor space for the students, or you also had the opportunity to use your ORG eligibility and build an entirely new school. So what we've seen some districts do in the past is combine eligibility from different sites, take a little from each school, and then build a new school in an area that would work for the students that they were trying to serve. And actually, before we get into eligibility, if I can ask you to flip to page 26, we have a before and after picture for an ORG project down there. So you'll see that this was one of the better photos we could get, where you see the portables are taking up some of the blacktop space there, not a lot of green space, and then you're able to get a field and a playground into the project at the end. So moving back to page 25, the funding for an ORG project, again, this is a new construction type of funding concept because you're on a 50-50 state and local match basis. It uses the same grant amount as the new construction program does. So we've got the 2012 amounts listed down there. So if you come in for ORG in 2012, that's what your pupil grants are going to be based on. And one of the unique things about this program is that the eligibility is not necessarily tied to the grade level served by the portables. So districts will generate both a district-wide bank of eligibility and then eligibility at each site. And if you have K-6 pupil grants generated under this program, you don't have to match that up to the exact project. So you can request your funding at whatever grade level you have overall eligibility for. So that's a little bit unique in the program.
But do you have to use it where you have the overcrowding?
You have to relieve overcrowding at the school site. So the next step once you've done the project is you have to remove the portables from that campus. So you can't generate the eligibility and then leave that portable and keep running the pupils in there. You have to actually remove that classroom from K-12 usage in the district. So you might be able to put it somewhere for storage, but we ideally would like to see demolition.
So is there a way of identifying the school that just has 2 portables and they still have the blacktop versus one that has 20 portables and doesn't have the blacktop anymore, and making sure that you're replacing the portables where there's no place for the kids to play?
Well, I wouldn't, and I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't think that the school with 2 portables is going to qualify for the density. So in order to generate eligibility, you have to meet a density standard of 175%, I believe, of what CDE recommends. So the 2 portables, depending on the site, says I don't think that's going to qualify. So in order for that school site to qualify, there's a certain threshold. So it is the ones that are truly overcrowded.
So you have district-wide eligibility, but it's based on just those schools that have been identified as.
Right. Right. Okay. Also under ORG, there is the possibility to do a hybrid project. So we've seen some districts come in that are doing either a new construction or a modernization project, and they've been able to incorporate an ORG project as well. So they might be addressing unhoused students that they're projecting from the future, as well as relieving overcrowding from an existing school site. And while the funding streams are completely separate and it requires separate project accounting, that type of project will work. We can take a look at the plans and figure out which portion should fall under the new construction program or modernization program and which portion should fall under ORG. So there is some flexibility for districts in designing their projects that way. And then just kind of a current status of where we're at. We have cycle 10 projects at NOPSC for processing. That round of ORG funding closed at the end of July. And after the Cycle 10 projects go to the State Allocation Board, there will be about $103 million estimated left in bond authority for the program. And recently the board approved Cycles 11 and 12 for this program. Any questions on that one? Okay. Then moving on to page 27, we have the Charter School Facilities Program. And this program has been around in Proposition 47, Prop 55, and also 1D. And this program has certainly evolved with each bond and changed quite a bit. So we'll give you the high level of that. We, I think, could give you a week's worth of information on how this program has changed. But the Charter School Facilities Program in its current state allows for both new construction or rehabilitation. Now, in general, what this program does is it allows charter schools to construct new facilities, or it allows them to use existing district facilities that are at least 15 years old, and they can rehabilitate them to meet the needs of their program. Now, it can be charter schools on their own that are applying, or it can be a district on behalf of a charter school, either an independently operated charter school or a district charter school. The eligibility process for this program is a bit different as it relates to both new construction and modernization. So when you're looking at a new construction project under the Charter School Facilities Program, the eligibility calculation that I went over earlier in new construction, it applies but not in the same way. There doesn't need to be positive new construction eligibility for a charter school to move forward under this program. What they have to do is the school district must have established new construction eligibility. And then what the school district will do is submit a certification from the school board as to the number of unhoused pupils that the project will serve. If the district indicates that the project will serve 100 pupils, then that amount is deducted from the district's baseline eligibility. If the district determines that the project will not serve any of its pupils for various reasons, then there is no eligibility deduction from the district's new construction eligibility. The rehabilitation, I'm sorry, is there a question?
I'm sorry, how could that be if there was nothing to deduct, that there wouldn't be a project, would there?
There can still be a project under the charter school program.
How?
The district is coming up with the certification. They're not married, basically. The eligibility is not driving the new construction for the charter school project because, in theory, what the district is certifying to OPSC and to the board is that, yes, the charter school is creating this facility, however, it is not serving any of our unhoused students. So I guess the basic example might be the charter school has a need in the north section of town because that's the population base they want to serve. All of the district students, all of the unhoused students may be coming from the south section of town. That is something that we've seen in the program, is that this project is not serving any of our unhoused students because as a district we don't have a need in the north section of town. Our need is over here. But the charter school's need is there.
What do you do in the situation where the charter school is serving a significant number of non-district students? I mean, the district, you're saying, could potentially lose eligibility, but what about those other districts where the students are coming from?
Well, there's a couple different ways to account for that. I'm not sure how much detail we want to go into here, but the preference points, when charter schools are selected to receive a preliminary apportionment, typically the pot of funding that's available to them is not enough to cover all the applicants. So preference points for relieving, for serving unhoused students in the district is factored in. So if a district certifies that the project is serving their students, then they would get a higher preference than a school that is not. On the eligibility calculation for new construction, when a school district is counting charter school enrollment, there's different ways to account for that. Each district needs to look at the charter schools that are in their boundaries and also the students that are going either from their district to District B or the kids that they're absorbing, so you can still account for your kids. So there's different factors that are done to try to address that. But that piece of it comes into play also in the preference points in this program. I don't think we didn't go too much into preference points in the funding of this program, though. And then similar to the new construction component, the rehabilitation is a little bit different criteria. Under modernization, as Tracy mentioned earlier, when you're modernizing portables, they need to be 20 years old, and when you're modernizing permanent facilities, they need to be 25 years old. For the charter school rehabilitation component, the facility needs to only be 15 years old and district owned.
So could you give me an example of, for an education component, I mean, when any school does modernization, you've got an education component. So give me an example.
Well, I think we're seeing that what we've seen on some of the applications, rehabilitation is new, so we haven't had a ton of rehabilitation applications go through the program, but the facility that the district may have available, maybe it's a K-6 facility, and the charter school needs 9-12 facilities, but maybe the building's in a perfect location, so maybe they need to account for science labs, so they can reconfigure the inside of the building. We have seen things that look more like modernization. We've seen entire campuses that were used for charter school purposes. The district was able to make an entire campus available, and that one looked very much like a modernization project. A lot of the components are very similar. So rehabilitation and modernization, there's not a lot of distinction between the two.
I was going to wait to the end. We go through all these charts, but I keep seeing these little examples of the bathroom or the grant amount per student. And they vary greatly, and I'm trying to get some context on that. You given, certain amounts, 3,600 for one type of construction, 9,000 for the other, but the buildings, to me, are pretty much the same. So how do we come up with the figures there?
The new construction pupil grant, in addition to just the base classrooms, that's also intended to cover things like your core facilities. So some of that's going towards building a multi-purpose room or a gymnasium, admin facilities, the extra things that are just above and beyond just the one classroom on the, and then there's also site things that need to be done that don't necessarily fall under the site development categories as well. So new construction, when you look at the base grant, even without the supplemental grants, it's designed to cover more perhaps than a modernization grant would. So I believe those are the two that you're looking at. The 3,600 is for modernizing, so you don't need to start from scratch there. In most cases, you can choose to do a like-for-like replacement, in which case it does look a lot like a new construction project because you're demolishing the building and replacing it. That is a local decision, and yes, you are working with a different funding source there. But in general, the modernization grants are lower because you're not actually constructing a brand new facility. You're enhancing the existing facility. Okay. So back to the charter school program, the funding concept is similar to the critically overcrowded schools program, where there's a preliminary apportionment made, and then that's based on a concept, and then the schools move forward and they have 4 years with the possible 1-year extension to bring it to a final apportionment stage, which is when they have the full project ready, the complete DSA approved plans, CDE approved plans. They've got the site identified and are ready to go, and that is the final apportionment stage. There are some other unique components in this, in that the matching share, as one mentioned earlier, they do not qualify for financial hardship, but there is a loan component available. As frequently, charter schools will not have any facilities funds to draw from. They don't have bonding capacity available to them. So the way that they pay their facilities costs is through their general fund. So the option for them under this program is to take out a loan for up to the full 50% matching share requirement. And that loan involves another state agency, the California School Finance Authority, that evaluates whether or not the charter school's is financially sound to pay back the loan to the state over a period of up to 30 years. So the matching share can be done on a loan basis. Also, the charter school facility program requires agreements between the charter school, the state, and the school district. And title to the project facilities can be held by somebody other than the school district, depending on the circumstances. It can be held by the charter school themselves or by a local governmental entity. And you will see those requests upon occasion in the state allocation board agendas, because those do go before the board if anybody other than the school district is opting to hold title to these projects. And the program agreements outline what happens to the facility in the event that the charter school should ever cease to use the facilities for charter school purposes.
Barbara, could you summarize those projects that are based on that the project has to be completed before they come in, or through all approvals before they come in, versus those that have a reservation of funds?
Sure. For the preliminary apportionments, what you have is an idea, paper napkin idea, for lack of a better term. So you know that you have a need for maybe 10 classrooms based on what you've been seeing in your charter school area. You think you need 10 new classrooms, and you'd like to put it in school district B over here, because that's where your charter petition is authorized and that's where your kids are. So you'd like to build it here. You don't know exactly where, but within this 6-mile radius. So you have kind of a concept. You can submit the preliminary apportionment application, which asks basically for an idea. Give us an estimate of what you think this project is going to be. So you don't have CDE approval of the site yet, necessarily. Some people do, but in most cases the concept is that you don't have approval of the site because you may not know what site you're using. You haven't gone through DSA because you haven't started to design your building yet. In fact, you don't necessarily even know how many kids you're ultimately going to build for. That piece is the one thing that stays the most constant because you cannot increase the number of pupil grants that you request on this application. So probably the one constant is how many kids you're going to build for. It can go down, but the program doesn't allow for it to increase. So you have an idea, and then you don't necessarily go forward with your idea and move into full construction mode because the funding for the program is very limited. I think we had, in the last round, we maybe were able to provide preliminary apportionments to half of the applicants that requested it. I could be off on the numbers, it's been a while. So you don't know if you're going to get any funds to do this project, so a lot of the charter schools don't want to move forward until they know they have the matching share reserved for them in bond authority from the state because they don't have any other way of paying for this project. That's compared to 4 years down the road or any time up to that 4 years down the road where they know they've got the bond authority that's set aside for them. Now they go out and they find the site. They work with CDE and determine, okay, yes, the site on the corner of 5th and N is going to be where we're going to locate the school. They've got an appraisal for the school site. They have determined whether or not it needs any sort of cleanup for hazardous materials. So they've gone through and done testing. They've looked at it. They might even have purchased it at that point. There's options for doing that. So once they've determined the site, that can help shape the design of the building. So now they can start figuring out, okay, well, we wanted to add 10 classrooms. Are they going to be, you know, what's the configuration going to be? What else can we afford to put on there? So they actually work with an architect and they go through the division of the state architect to make sure that the plans that they're designing have met all the requirements under the Field Act and that DSA will approve the plans. So now they've got CDE approval for the site. They've got DSA approval for the plans. Hopefully they've been working with CDE at the same time to get the plan approval to make sure that the buildings that they're designing are going to meet the requirements of the education program that they're going to be providing. So now they're down to these stages. Once they get all the plan approvals necessary, then they are at that stage where they can submit to the state allocation board for a final apportionment, or in these days an unfunded approval. So in the very beginning it's just an idea. It's a reservation of funds so that you can fully develop the actual project while knowing that there is state matching funds available for you when you actually get to the stage of being able to submit to the state allocation board.
Excuse, can you tell me how many of these have not been converted yet?
Most of them are still within their time frame. So with Proposition 47, it was about a 50% conversion rate. There were only 6 projects to work from, though. The timelines on these projects were stopped during the fiscal crisis because there was no guarantee of funding to go forward. So the board took several actions to try to not harm those people that were participating in the program. So I think we should know more. We've got some deadlines coming up, I think, for the next round of projects from Proposition 55 pretty soon, but it's a little early to tell on some of them.
So Barbara, in summary, then the charter school program, the career technical education program, overcrowded relief grant program, and critically overcrowded school program were all a reservation program. Is that correct?
On Career Tech, I believe they had an option for reservation of funds, but they could also be ready to go forward.
And then the remaining projects were all, you must have all approvals prior to.
Did you mention ORG in your first?
I did.
No,
It's
ORG, you need to be ready
critically
to
overcrowded schools.
Just the critically overcrowded schools charter, and then there was an option under the Career Tech.
So ORG still has to have final approvals
Yes.
before accessing?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think just in summary on the charter school program, On page 28, we've got the funding formulas there for rehabilitation and new construction. With new construction, once you actually get to the final apportionment stage, it looks almost exactly the same as a regular SFP new construction application. It's based on pupil grants, the same pupil grants that are used for new construction projects. And then rehabilitation is done on a square footage basis. That is different than modernization because there are no pupil grants associated with the calculation. So we're looking at the square footage of the area that's going to be rehabilitated. And that actually can change from preliminary to final because sometimes the project changes, but we look at the final project, what is it that you're actually going to rehabilitate, and then apply the square footage calculations to the amount of toilet square footage and then other facility square footage. And it's just based on the square footage amount. Any questions on charter before I turn it back over to Tracy for high performance? Okay.
So the High Performance Incentive Program was a result of Proposition 1D. And the purpose of this program, it's actually an incentive grant that attaches to the other programs such as new construction, modernization, overcrowded relief grant, critically overcrowded schools, charter, and CTE projects very recently were added to this as well. And it provides additional grants to districts to incentivize green components in their projects, or high performance attributes is a more accurate term. And so these high performance attributes include in the design that promote energy and water efficiency, maximize natural lighting, improve the indoor air quality, utilizing recycled materials and materials that emit a minimum of toxic substances, and to employ acoustics that are conducive to teaching and learning. Eligibility for the program is based on a high performance rating criteria. Basically, the project is designed with these criteria in mind and then reviewed by the Division of the State Architect to determine their actual number of points achieved. And what the high performance rating criteria was modeled after the Collaborative for High Performance schools criteria, but it was adjusted slightly to focus on the facility components of high performance. And so we have the adopted high performance rating criteria that include 5 basic categories that are there on page 29. Sustainable site selection, reduced water usage, energy efficiency, use of sustainable, renewable, and or recycled materials, and indoor environmental quality. Since the regulations were first approved and adopted, they've been updated a couple of times to account for updates in the Collaborative for High Performance criteria, and as well as California Green Code requirements. And then there were also some changes that increased the percentages of the grant that a district would get based on their points. So since it was first adopted, there have been a couple of changes to the program. For the funding requirements, basically, as I mentioned, the districts is going to design with these components in mind, and then the plans will be reviewed by DSA to determine their final points value that they've achieved. They must, excuse me, hit some minimum requisites in each of these categories. And then some of the next things we'll go over, hopefully we'll address some of your questions, Ms. Moore, about the differences in funding between modernization and new construction.
Thank you.
So for a new construction project on a new school site, the minimum points that must be obtained is 27 for a maximum of 88. And at least 4 of those have to be in the category of superior energy performance and alternate energy sources. And if we go to page 30, there's a description of the minimum points required for additions to sites, new construction additions, and modernization. And for those projects, the minimum points is slightly less, it's 20, and the maximum is 84. So if we move down to the funding formula for this, we have a chart here that shows what the percentage increase will be for a project depending on how many points it's achieved, from the minimum of 20 all the way excuse me, up to the maximum of 84. Now this scale here applies to all of the projects, both the new construction, additions, and, or excuse me, I'm sorry, I misspoke.
It's a modernization. And
That's just the modernization. Sorry,
But it also covers additions.
and it covers additions. I've lost my train of thought on the new construction projects. I apologize. Might need some help on this one. I just lost my train of thought completely. So,
Let's go through the example.
okay, sorry. Thank you. So, for example, on a modernization project that has 46 points, the project base grant being is $500,000. The HP base incentive grant is $250,000. And so, looking at this project, if it got 46 points, and at the scale there, we take our project increase of 500,000 times the 8.32%, and you get your total grant of 41,600. Each site is eligible for the base incentive grant one time. For a new school, it would be 150,000, and for a modernization project or an existing site, or in addition to an existing site, it would be 250,000.
So Tracy, is it fair to say that for high performance incentives, we have established between 2 and 11% additional cost, or additional amount that we would provide to a project?
Plus the base grant, in addition. Plus the base grant. Yeah,
The-
the table
the-
there shows the percentage increase on the
base
on the
grant?
base grant, plus there's the high performance incentive grant.
Correct. So again, we are, for incentive only, we've established between 2 and 11% additional cost for a project.
That's right.
Thank you.
And then you have, and now we move to energy efficiency, which should be part of green performance too, right? Aren't they tied together?
Energy efficiency is just a little bit different in that it was a result of, or was included in Propositions 47 and 55. At this point, the funding is exhausted for it. It's all been accounted for and is no longer available. But it was a supplemental grant that basically preceded HPI, and similar in nature, except that it focused on energy cost savings only. So for a modernization project, the project had to demonstrate that it was exceeding energy efficiency standards by at least 10%, and for a new construction project by at least 15%. And the components are listed there: conservation, load reduction technology, peak load shifting, solar water heating technology, ground source heating and cooling, photovoltaics, and other technologies that meet emerging technology. And once again, in the case of energy efficiency, it was reviewed by the Division of the State Architect to basically determine the final points, and then an increase up to 5% was provided based on the points the district achieved on that. No questions? We'll move on to Career Tech. So the Career Technical Education Facilities Program as well was a result of Proposition 1D. It provides funding for a local education agency, which could be a school district or a joint powers authority, to build new CTE facilities or modernize existing ones. Districts had two options for requesting funding. They could come in with a project, as we mentioned earlier, fully planned, DSA approved plans done, and get an apportionment for that right away, or they could have a plan that was approved through the approval process at Department of Education and not quite have their DSA plans ready to go and request a reservation of funds. The CTE program also offers funding for equipment as part of the facilities, and grants for new construction are maximized at $3 million state share, and new construction was maximized, and this was in statute, at $1.5 million. Now, the Career Tech program did not allow for financial hardship, so districts could ask for a loan to cover their 50% share. Under the program, the first step, which was actually part of the requirements, was to go through an approval process with the Division of the State Architect. Districts would submit their plan, their career technical education plan, to the CDE during an open filing period and get their plan reviewed and scored, and once they got a minimum score, they would then submit their application and filing rounds to the to OPSC, and projects would be ranked based on their score and their locale, urban, suburban, or rural, to ensure distribution of the program funds. So some of the CTE plan was to be scored by the Department of Education, and some of the components there were spelled out in the statute. Basically, the course of study had to be within one of the 15 approved industry sectors. It would offer include enrollment projections, identify the feeder schools and industry partners, accountability, and coordination with other area schools. And as I said, once they received a minimum score, they could apply for funding. The Career Tech program is a 50-50 program for both the modernization and the new construction portion. It's based on construction costs, site development costs, and equipment. And a project could consist entirely of equipment if they so chose, because Career Tech programs can be equipment intensive. So when I move to page 33, you can see
Excuse me, I have a question about the Career Tech. Do you know the sort of the ratio between new construction or new program or modernization of existing program, or just equipment?
I don't think we have those specifics. We have a fast facts, but I don't know off the top of my head how many were just equipment versus, let's see, take a quick here. On page 48, we have some fast facts about the program. And we had 470 total projects that were approved, 472 approved by the board, but I'd have to get back to you with specifics on new construction, mod, and equipment only.
Okay, thank you.
But it was definitely something that was accessed in the program. There were definitely equipment-only requests.
The other piece of information that we have as well is how many of the different sectors.
Yes.
It was what was applied by sector that I think would be of interest to the board as well on that. And just a comment that this is the only program that we have that really it was unique and new, and it was a collaboration of, it had to be an education. It was based on the educational plan first. And that was the scoring that the Department of Ed did if you made a certain threshold, and then it was funded as a project. So it was clearly educationally program driven.
And I'd like to add to that, I think one of the reasons that the reservation of funds component was added to this program was specifically for that. Districts didn't know if they would get funding right away, and there was a desire to get this funding out there. So if they went through that intensive review of developing their plan and submitting it to the Department of Education, there was an expectation that this was going to be a very competitive program. So that's where the reservation of funds component came in. They got that minimum score and then could make a determination, okay, I want to move forward. And then after they got their SAB apportionment and found out that yes, they would be funded, they would have 12 months to submit their final approved plans to OPSC to then qualify for a fund release for the project. Okay, and just a quick example of the funding formula is there on page 33. That the funding formula is, like I said, a 50-50 program, so 50% of the construction costs, plus, and that would include site development, any applicable equipment, and then there are some supplemental grants that can be added to a career tech project, but there is, as I mentioned, a cap within statute that it couldn't go over $3 million. So those supplemental grants must still be within the $3 million, except for if they qualify for a high performance incentive grant on the project that's coming from a different fund source. So that could be added to the cap.
So if on the one hand, I'm trying to hold all the questions on all these again, but so if a district is building a new high school, you would get your per pupil grants plus the CTE, and that doesn't diminish the per pupil grants that you get.
I'll explain that a little bit further. There is an option for a standalone project that basically would be separate from a new construction or mod application. But districts would have the option of submitting a joint, basically, forget what I heard, a combined application or two applications. So if I had in my new high school 5 career tech classrooms, and I requested pupil grants for them, so the base cost of the classroom is there. I could also submit a career tech application to cover the excess costs over and above those 5 classrooms, and it might be separate applications to cover equipment and any other excess costs for that. And how we account for that is we look at the current year chart, the current replacement cost for a basic 960 square foot classroom, subtract that from the total cost of the career tech project that's being submitted, and the based on number of classrooms to get this career tech grant.
You're paying the marginal cost of having of building a career tech versus a regular classroom, in essence.
They're getting additional grants for that.
Right.
Under career
And if
tech.
you're adding a career tech building to an existing school that maybe doesn't have new construction eligibility to add a new career tech classroom, then the basic funding mechanism you describe here would apply.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't require any new construction or modernization eligibility, and won't affect modernization eligibility on your existing snapshot or your existing eligibility baselines for either one. Doesn't impact it at all.
I know. It's hard, and I have a couple of pages of questions, actually. Okay. I promise I'll hold my questions since we're almost to the end here. So we have just, two? Joint use, seismic, actually we have, and the financial hardship, so.
Okay, for the joint use program, this program provides funding for facilities that a district might not otherwise be able to build due to lack of financial resources on their own. So they might want to partner with another government agency, higher education provider, or a nonprofit organization to build a facility such as a gymnasium or a library or multipurpose room, for example. There's 2 types of projects. There's a type 1 project where a district can increase the size of a current facility gymnasium, child care facility, library, or teacher education facility. And this would be part of a new construction application. There's type 2, which could be a standalone facility or part of a modernization project. And basically one of the requirements for type 2 is that they don't already have this type of facility or it's considered inadequate. Funding for a joint use project is provided on a 50-50 state and local share. The joint use partner must provide up to 25% of the contribution. There is an allowance for that if the district can elect to cover the entire amount if it is specifically allowed for in their local bond. The district could cover that 25% for their partner. The funding is based on a square footage basis, but is maxed out by grade level. K6, the maximum joint use grant is $1 million. For a middle school, it's $1.5 million, and for a high school, it's $2 million. And on the following page, page 35, we have a chart there to reflect the current 2012 grant amounts per square foot. And basically for toilet facilities and anything non-toilet. So the funding formula is to take the proposed square footage of the projects times the applicable square footage amount above, and that gives you your base grant. Plus, in step 2, there can be some extra costs allowed under type 1 and whatever supplemental grants they might qualify for. And then it's a 50-50. As Juan mentioned earlier, there is no financial hardship allowance for this program, and there is not a loan component either.
Okay, and that brings us to the next program, which is the Facility Hardship Program. And we have this broken into two pieces, Facility Hardship and Seismic, but in actuality, both those programs, well, both those projects fall under the Facility Hardship Program. Seismic is a subset of Facility Hardship. But the Facility Hardship Program, the purpose of this program is to address the projects that are the health and safety issues. So if a district has determined that they have a critical need for housing pupils either because of the current condition of the facilities or because of lack of facilities, they can apply for the Facility Hardship Program. Now, the Facility Hardship Program does not require new construction eligibility or modernization eligibility. However, if a building is replaced under Facility Hardship, then it does reset the clock to determine modernization eligibility of that facility later on. But to meet the criteria for the Facility Hardship Program, a district needs to go through several steps. They need to determine what their problem is. When they submit the application, we need to see a report from an industry specialist identifying what the problem is and the minimum work necessary to mitigate the problem. Once they have that report, they take it to the appropriate governmental entity that can concur both with the health and safety threat as well as the minimum work required for the fix. And the governmental entity that they take this to can be different depending on what the problem is. It might be the public health department. In structural cases, that would be the division of the state architect. Just depends on sometimes it's the water department if there's an issue with something related to the water. So it just depends on what the problem is, which governmental entity the school district needs to contact. Now, once they have those pieces, they can submit to OPSC for processing to the State Allocation Board. One of the things that OPSC will check is if there is a continuing need for the facility, so we look at enrollment. No sense replacing a closed school that the district doesn't have a need for right now. So that is something that is looked at. And then the funding determination, the district, under facility hardship, there is, it's not really an option, but there is either a replacement project or a rehabilitation project or repair project. So the district and OPSC look at how much it's going to cost to solve the problem. and there's a 50% threshold. So basically, if the cost to fix the problem is less than 50% of the cost to replace the facility, then you are under a repair component. So it's cheaper to repair it than it is to replace it. If you exceed that 50% threshold, if it's going to cost more than 50% of what it would cost you to just replace the building, then you end up into a replacement project. And that determination, repair versus replacement, determines how you're funded. If it's a repair project, it's considered part of the modernization funds, so you receive a 60-40 split where the state is paying 60% and the district is paying 40% of the project. Under replacement, it's 50-50 because that comes from our new construction funds. Now, let's see. In advance of going forward with the project, the school district can choose to submit what's considered a conceptual approval for consideration by the State Allocation Board. And what this approval does is it looks at the health and safety threat before the district has the DSA approved plans to fix the problem. So they are coming forward to the board and asking whether or not the health and safety threat that they have is going to be acceptable under the program. And once they get approval for that conceptual approval, then they can go forward with confidence knowing that it qualifies for funding under the program, and they can go and develop their plans to fix the problem. The funding formula, it varies depending on whether it is a replacement or a repair project. And also there is the concept where sometimes you don't need to replace an entire school. You might just be replacing one building on the school site. So there are different ways to look at these projects when funding, but if it's a replacement project, it uses the new construction pupil grants, just like regular new construction. So if you're building the same thing, it's a brand new facility, so the same new construction grants apply. Minus, of course, you're not always doing the core facilities, but when you're doing a new campus, then you have the same needs as you would with a new construction project. If you're in a replacement situation, then we fund on a square footage basis. And let's see. For rehabilitation, when we're looking at the funding, we're also looking at cost estimates, because the facility hardship program is only designed to cover the minimum work necessary to mitigate the problem. So facility hardship fixes what the current problem is, but it doesn't necessarily modernize your facility unless, of course, you're in a full replacement mode. So in the event where you're not replacing, you may still need modernization down the line. Also, state funding for facility hardship is reduced if the district does receive things such as insurance proceeds for the issue, perhaps litigation proceeds, any type of settlement funds. So all of those things are offset from the amount that the state provides for the facility hardship projects. And then I'm going to just move right into the seismic mitigation program. Pretty much everything I just said there applies to seismic as well, with the exception that under seismic we're dealing with a separate pot of funding. So the seismic funding, everything under seismic is 50-50 because of where the funds came from. They came out of new construction. So even if you are just doing a repair project under seismic, it's a 50-50 local and state matching share. And then the eligibility changes just a little bit too, because you need to have a qualifying building. And on page 38, under eligibility, we've got some different criteria here. The facility has to be identified by DSA as a qualifying Category 2 building, and it has to be designed for occupancy by students and staff. The minimum work necessary, that's the same as facility hardship. DSA will provide a concurrence with the structural engineer's report that identifies the structural deficiencies. And then also there are other issues that could come up on the site. You could have things with the soils, either faulting or liquefaction issues, potentially landslides. If you have any of those issues and that's what you're applying for, then the California Geological Survey must also concur with your geologic analysis. And that corresponds to the governmental concurrence that you see for other issues in the facility hardship program. And for these projects, the construction contract, if there already is one, needs to have been executed on or after May 20th, 2006. And again, like with the other program, you do not need new construction or modernization eligibility to participate in this program. They can still request a conceptual approval. And the funding formulas are similar to those that we discussed in the facility hardship program. And with that, Jason's up here for financial hardship.
Okay, and then we'll go over the last program, starting on page 40, the financial hardship program. Basically, the SFP financial hardship programs assist districts and county office of education that cannot provide their full matching share for their SFP new construction or modernization projects. You can see right there in the eligibility section, it gives a table that has the basic eligibility criteria for a financial hardship project. In order to qualify for the program, you have to be leveling the maximum developer fees eligible, justified under law, and meet one of the following criteria. The district has a total bonding indebtedness of at least 60% of their total bonding capacity, or they've passed a successful Prop 39 bond within the previous 2 years and are using the proceeds on SFP projects. The district, or if it's a county office or of education, then they qualify. If the district's total bonding capacity for smaller districts is less than $5 million, they also qualify. If they don't meet one of those 4 basic criteria, then they do have the option to come to the board and present other evidence of reasonable effort. Once the district or COE has met that basic eligibility requirement, then the OPSC will review the district's financial records to make a determination of any available funds the district would have to contribute to their SFP projects. Only after both the review of the eligibility and the review of the district's financial records to determine what available funds they have can the district qualify for financial hardship status. If the district meets those basic eligibility requirements and the local funds are less than the required contribution, then the state will make up the difference under this program. They have a real basic example here. If the project cost was $100, under the basic program it's $50 for the state share and $50 for the local match. In this example, when we did the financial hardship review, it was determined that the district had $30 available towards their SFP projects. Therefore, then, the total financing to this to the district would be the $50 state share, the $20 for financial hardship apportionment, and that for a total state contribution of $70, and then the other $30 to make the project complete would be made up by the district's local match. The funding continued on page 41. One thing that the financial hardship districts have are the added flexibility to come in for a requested separate site or design grant prior to requesting their full adjusted grant. Once a district has been granted financial hardship status, their expenditures within the capital facility funds that we review are limited to the verifiable contracts and encumbrances that were entered into and approved by the OPSC prior to their initial financial hardship application. Anything spent beyond those initial encumbrances or those initial approved expenditures will be treated as district contribution, will be deducted from the financial hardship apportionments. Financial hardship project savings is treated a little bit different than a regular 50-50 project. That savings needs to be either, one, returned to the state, or can be used to offset a future financial hardship project within the next 3 years. If after those 3 years the complete savings has not been spent by the district, then it must be returned to the state with any applicable interest. Once a district is approved for financial hardship status, they have 180 days or 6 months to submit their application for funding. If they have not come in for that application, or if they have additional phases to come in for a particular project, then they will have to resubmit and try to reestablish their financial hardship eligibility at that time. If a project is on the unfunded list for more than 180 days, then the district's financial records will undergo a re-review to determine if there's any additional funds to apply to those projects on the unfunded list before they receive an apportionment. But it will not be a review to check their eligibility again. It's only a review to determine if there's any additional funds to apply to those projects on the unfunded list.
Okay, that takes us to an end of the program review, which is rather complicated. I know I have some questions on a number of the programs, and I do have some on the financial hardship. So is it okay if we start there and then we'll go back to the others? Sure. On the financial hardship, you can meet any one of the following criteria. How did we come up with district indebtedness being at least 60% of the bonding capacity and not 100%? I mean, why is it that one district, do we require one district, they'll pass a bond, and their voters are paying for that bond, and in another, you're just at 60%, and you don't have to go back for a bond, and you can qualify for financial hardship. So the voters in District A, in essence, are paying for schools in District B. So you know how we came up with that 60%?
I'm not positive how they originally came up with that amount. I know the basic premise of the statute is that the district should be making all reasonable effort to fund their share of the projects. So they worked to come up what would be reasonable. And they wanted to make sure that the district was contributing to their projects, that they had issued at least some bonds, that they had made some local effort or issued some certificates of participation.
But the requirement is any one of these. So you can be at 60% and not have to pass a local bond and qualify for financial hardship unless I'm missing something. Is that?
No, you're correct. Then that could be, that 60% could be part of a previous bond that they had passed, used on earlier projects, and perhaps the full amount of that debt is not on there, but they're still above that 60% threshold. They don't have to pass a new bond within the last 2 years, like one of the other criteria, if they do meet that 60%.
Okay.
And one thing, too, to consider, when the SFP program originally started, this is not where the criteria was set. I believe originally the outstanding bond indebtedness was initially at 30%, and it wasn't passing a Prop 39 bond within the last 2 years. It was at least attempting a bond that received, I believe, 50%, 55% plus one vote. And at least if you attempted that bond, you could also qualify that way. When they did, I think it was back in 2004 when they felt that, this really wasn't meeting the statute of all reasonable effort. We took that away. The Prop 39 bond came into existence. There was an additional way for the districts to pass these bonds rather than traditional 2/3 bonds. So that's when we took away just attempting the bond, and you had to at least pass it within 2 years, and bumped up the 30% to the 60%.
And do we know what percentage of districts now are at the 60%? I would think with the declines in assessed values of homes that we would have a significantly higher percentage that are at that threshold. Do we know what that is?
We don't know exactly, but we can get that information for you and maybe give you a breakout of where the districts are, the ones that qualified, and what percentages they were qualifying under.
Else have any questions on the financial hardship? Okay, I know some of you have been holding back questions. I've been trying. So, any questions from members here? Kathleen, go ahead.
Always have questions. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for this. I hate to call it a binder after all the latest news we got lately, but it is a good binder. Okay. I think it's the clearest that's been laid out for me for the last couple of years, and I think it should be something we give to any new board member in the future. Kind of like the program, although all these programs could be no more funding here shortly, but as new ones come on, we should have something like this. And we're looking at all these costs. I could do the math and figure out the percentages, how you split things up, but they're still based on a per grant amount per student, whatever grade they're in, to come up with these numbers. And I'm just wondering if you have any more background information you can get to me later about how these numbers come up with. How did you come up with $9,400 per student per place? And more importantly, how does that compare to maybe other states and what they cost? If they break it down, that sort of thing, some kind of apple-and-apple comparison if possible. This I don't expect any comments on, but this is something hopefully we discuss in more depth later, because this is just a review of the project. But as I'm looking at some of the costs built in here, we're talking about educating our kids and what it takes to educate them, the facilities to do that. And we talked about some of the high efficiency grants, well, anywhere from 2 to 11% plus the base grant. With maybe the ambience lighting or something, I'm not sure what does that add to that student's education. It definitely adds to the operational costs of that school. Maybe it reduces it in energy. Same thing with the energy grants, but there's between possibly 10 and 15% cost on top of basic construction right there. And I'm sure a lot of people in the audience can respond if that's good or bad, but is that this goes to operational costs of the school, does that add anything to the student's education? There's been other studies that I brought to the board's attention not too long ago about the different labor components and such that add cost to it as well. And I just think as we go into this new period where we're going to design a new bond, we have to look at those base costs. Are we getting the best bang for our dollar? Are some of these good agendas part of operational costs? Are there good social goals? And are we positioned to fund those going on forward? So I'm hoping that as we future meetings, at least with the numbers part of it, I can understand a little more about how they compare to other schools, other projects, price per square foot, those type of things, that as we get into it, and how can we more specifically, if I was trying to build most, because even at the first two levels, it's the high efficiency and energy grants, and if you add the between 11 and 13% for the labor components part of it, that's 20%. 20% of $35 billion to $7 billion. It's a lot of money we could spend in other schools just in those three things alone. And I'm not sure if that's something we could dig in a little bit deeper go forward. Thank you.
I have a comment to that. I know of two reports that could be shared with the board. One was done in 2006, and it was across the nation. It was spending trends taken from data on total capital spending from all sources and reported for school districts across the nation. It was done by the BEST organization. And also there was a specific report that was done for California in terms of costs that was also done by the BEST organization, I think at the Center for Cities and Schools. So that might be data that would be interesting to be shared, as well as whatever the Office of Public School Construction might have on that.
I got three in my iPhone right here. So we'll miss this done. Thank you.
Other questions?
I had a number of comments, but in terms of questions...
Oh, questions or comments will...
I think as we look at the existing programs, one of the key components of it is the classroom count. That's how all eligibility, with exceptions, I think that the staff talked about, was determined. And I think that bears looking at as we move forward in the future, because classroom count is assumptive that we have square classrooms in our schools, and that educational programming has really changed since 1998 when this was established. And I think that looking at educational programming in conjunction with how we fund would be appropriate, so that we are not stifling good planning, good design that's based simply on the classrooms. I also think that as we look at the existing program versus future program, there are a number of resources that we could utilize, including the report that was done by UC Berkeley on public policy issues around this. I think that we could look at some of the unintended consequences of what we put in place. And, you know, there are examples of that. One that I can point out is that we have this extra funding for smaller sites, and whether we then drove some of the calculations or some of the schools to choose the a site that may be of less acreage to secure that funding, and whether, how that is. I think that also we have a disconnect in modernization, it appears to me, between what's actually needed to modernize a school versus a per pupil amount for that. I think historically the program emphasized new construction, and our modernization grant was part of that new construction component. And it didn't necessarily deal with what actually was needed for modernization, both for systems and then even moreover for educational adequacy of those buildings. So the per pupil grant for modernization, I think, bears some review as well. And then of interest to us and to the department also would be some of the data that's now resulted from all of these programs. Maybe the next suggestion for our future meeting is here's the baseline of all these programs, and then how did that translate out? What districts got what? What kinds of districts were those? Who accessed career technical education? What were those types? I think that would be of interest to us too as we move forward and would make that suggestion. I think those were my top issues.
If I may comment on that, I think it's a great idea if we could, because we have all these different bond amounts, and as we go out for future stuff, or we come up with a plan anyway, if we could take maybe one day and just focus on, a new construction program. Here's the cost, here's the examples, here's the ones that went overboard, the ones that cost less, here's the different breakdowns, here's the examples from other areas, and then we could tackle one subject at a time. And the next meeting we could have maybe the overcrowded relief type of portion, or whatever the case may be. We may not need a separate meeting for each one, but some of the bigger programs, I think we get your data from what we've done, as well as comparisons across the way, and then we can hopefully come up with some suggestions, if any.
And then my final piece would be that there, obviously, and the staff does point this out, there are two other major major entities that are involved in this: the California Department of Education, the Division of State Architect. And I think it would also be instructive to have basic information from those organizations as well, because whatever is done in those organizations and or what is done here impacts that. So all three work in concert in this program, and it would be important to know the components of each of those, together with the Department of Toxic Substance Control, which has an element in the program as well. And districts have to work within all of those entities, and also now with the Department of Industrial Relations. So there are a number of state agencies that impact this program, that anything that's done here or done in those entities is important. So I would suggest that they also provide some overview so that this body has that information going forward as well.
Do you have any questions? I have a few questions. When we start talking about eligibility for new construction, we talked about the fact that if you're I don't want to say large school district, but other than a small school district, eligibility expires every year, and you basically recalculate. If you're a very small school district, you can lock it in for 3 years, recognizing that you have variation. But we also substitute eligibility with the cohort, the planning cohort. In today's unique economic situation where developers have permits, and, they're going to go out and roll over their tentative maps or whatever, but we don't know if some of those developments are going to go in 5 years or 10 years or ever, but clearly you don't want to go, if I'm a developer, I don't want to go through the whole permitting process again, so I'm going to, keep them, keep the current permits until I, make a financial decision or whatever I'm going to do. How are we dealing with that with eligibility? It seems to me that we potentially are increasing eligibility or giving it to schools districts they can use it wherever they want for students that may be here in the near future and may not be here in the near future. And if the students maybe aren't going to arrive for a decade, what about the school where they're going to be here 2 years from now? I mean, how are we dealing with that?
The current process allows for districts that have approved and valid tentative subdivision maps to be used to augment the projections.
Right.
So as long as they're still, even if they have an extension,
active.
yes, then we add those to the enrollment projections.
I'll get into that later, but it just seems to me that we're in a different situation with tentative map approvals today than we were 5 years ago, and we want to be sure that as we prioritize funding, that the funding's going to those projects where the students are going to arrive soon versus projects where the students may not arrive for some time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed that back even 4 years ago, where the permits used to be valid for a year, and now there's almost like automatic extension for 2 or 3 years. Some communities even going longer than that. And I feel bad for the school board trying to plan 5-10-year plans where you don't know if a bunch of new houses are going through. I don't know what other component we could put there, but the best person that probably gives you the fever what's going on is the new construction starts in the community or the city. Is there a way to tie it in and say, hey, this has been dormant for 3 years, or right before, how do you make that determination? Like Anna was saying, there is a priority list there. There's not enough money to go for every project. I mean, how do you determine that, or maybe get some thought of how you check in on that?
Yeah, we haven't looked at it closely, but what we had done in the past is we do take a look at the tentative track maps each time the district's updating for enrollment. Sometimes permits have been pulled for some of those homes, in which case we don't count them in the enrollment projection, so that we do take a look at them. As far as just approved tentative track maps that just have extensions but no permits have been pulled, right now, again, the current process is that we continue to include them in the enrollment projections.
Well, yeah, it's just something I'd like to look into more. Maybe we have a discussion with the builders or somebody, but I mean, obviously I believe in the philosophy that you've got to build the schools so they're open in time when the children arrive. If we went back to the old program where they had to be here, then all we did was exacerbate the overcrowding situation. But I also believe that there's got to be some way, whether you're dealing with tentative maps, whether you have actually you've pulled the building permits, I don't know what the right way is to do it there, but I do think that we want to be sure, especially when you've got limited resources, that we're putting those resources where they're actually building and the students are going to arrive relatively soon. Senator Hagman asked about determining the per pupil grant amount, and I think that'll probably be an in-depth discussion at another meeting, but the adequacy of that. One of the, well, actually some of these I'll ask later.
I have one.
Go ahead.
While you're thinking.
No, go right ahead. I'm just going through my notes, so go ahead.
I think it would also be important to look at how we have worked with special education and alternative education programs. We definitely have rules and regulations around special education, but I think it would be important to delve into a bit alternative education programs, particularly those that are done by county offices of education, and how they fared in our new since 1998 versus how they fared prior to that. Would be an area that we could have additional information on.
I just have a comment. I just want to clarify that we give this ties into what Senator Hagman said many times, but we give the same grant amount for new construction regardless of the building type, correct? Portable, relocatable, permanent construction. And then a relocatable or a portable is eligible for modernization after 20 years, and permanent construction is eligible for modernization after 20 years, or 25 years, correct?
Correct.
So in essence, we're giving a tremendous incentive to have portable or relocatable buildings that don't cost as much. That, you know, I know in our district we had some relocatable schools where we had to tear down and replace them because we really couldn't figure out how to modernize them. But we have an incentive there not to build the permanent classroom buildings that we know are going to last decades longer.
It could be characterized as an incentive. It could also be characterized during the time of high construction costs. It was an alternative that was used because that's what people could do to control costs. So there's a varied amount of reasonings, I think, why districts choose modular or portable construction perhaps over permanent. I think it is an excellent one in which we should delve. It's also a product of a per pupil construction driven program versus a square footage or building type driven program, which I think is what you're raising.
Right, essentially yes. I mean, I actually think the biggest reasons we have them are, one, we all know as part of the program there was a time when we required that 30% of the classrooms be relocatable, even though you were never going to relocate them. We also know when we first implemented class size reduction, we did it in a way that said you better jump in right now, and so we had tremendous demand for the portable market then, and districts brought in all these wheel-on portables to participate in class size reduction because they were afraid if they didn't participate in the program, they'd be locked out. So, I mean, we had disincentives, I think, both in terms of what we required for construction and in terms of how we, as the legislature, implemented the class size reduction program, and then we live with that, and then we end up with critically overcrowded schools and other programs as a result of that. And I bring it up, I think, as you say, just because I do think we need to have a conversation on what do we want to incentivize. And obviously you can tell my bias is I want to incentivize permanent construction. I want to incentivize construction where over the life cycle it's less costly for districts to maintain them, and more likely that the modernization grants will be adequate because we've maintained them properly. And so I just brought that up because it just struck me that
And we had this discussion too, and I want to thank Tom for having lots of meetings with me over the last couple months. But one of the things too is we want these things to last, and we see them last for 60 years if we do it right, plus. And we're going to have to put new technology and new stuff into it, but the framework's going to be there. And I'm wondering, when we have your state architect division come out and give us a report, if there's some more flexibility in some of these designs, instead of building individual classrooms, that as the community grows and you have less K through 6 and you now have more junior high or those type of things, the communities grow in waves as well, that these basic structures can be more useful for other purposes as well. So take example, a K through 6 class or schools shut down for a while, or it's half the size. Could we take out half those classrooms the interior walls and make it a big community center now for a while, and then we put the walls back in. That takes a different kind of design element where you're building almost like a tilt-up on the outside, but inside we have permanent walls. But it allows that flexibility to add that community space, to add those things that may be desirable but not financed until later. But as the population changes up and down, we have that flexibility versus portables that you take in and out. It just really doesn't make as much sense. So,
well, two educational comments on that. We would, I think, flexibility is very important, and I think we ought to look at our program and how we fund and how that relates to flexibility. So if we're, hard walls classrooms, and that's what's the driver in funding, you're going to see hard-walled classrooms. If you have a driver in funding that says, we want to see you address a certain capacity, but you have flexibility within how you do that, then we're going to see that. So what we fund gets built, and I think it will be important to look at those two components. And then the other piece I would say about relocatables and portables, yes, we had the 30% requirement. We're knowledgeable that industry has grown as well, and there are a range of types of buildings within that industry, and some of which are high-performing relocatable structures that do serve a purpose. So again, we need to look at it in totality. Do we want the campuses to be 100% relocatable? Probably not. But do we want districts to have flexibility around those issues? Probably so. And so what kind of flexibility and what drivers do we put into that, I think would be important.
No, and I agree, and it's a whole other conversation, new construction again, but what you see in the office world, so to speak, are these tilt-ups there, concrete on the outside, steel beams, basically anything you want on the inside is stick and drywall. That sort of thing, but you have that flexibility space to design even every couple of years as you have new tenants come in, and we don't seem to have that flexibility of our classrooms as much, and that's a whole new way of constructing, but there's also a quicker way too.
I think too that also addresses an issue that we at the department are very concerned about, and that is educational modernization. How often is that arrived at? How often is it 25 years? Is that appropriate? Does education change every 25 years? Does it change sooner? And can we look at that in terms of our program drivers around educational adequacy, and not just building adequacy, but general educational adequacy? And that might be part of the solution that you talk about. I think it would be important, as I indicated earlier, to have the Division of State Architect, where a lot of those issues arise, to be able to talk to us about how it all operates with Title 24.
There are pluses and minuses to flexibility. I remember when we built the open classroom, and we had schools where you could see from one end to the other, and the teachers immediately started putting in bookcases to try and create some space. And the district where I was on the board, we actually ended up replacing 3 schools because we had this completely flexible idea and had problems. So I don't, I think they're great questions. I don't know to what extent. I mean, we're here to be a partner to local districts, so to what extent we should be driving all those decisions. But what I want to do now is take public comment, and then I'd like the board or the committee members here to have a little bit of a discussion in terms of some of these we've talked about now, how we want to move forward in terms of how we're going to break down and talk, have the essential components we want to talk about for potentially a new bond. So.
Got it. Madam Chair, members, Dave Walrath, representing Small School Districts Association. First of all, thank you for doing this, and thank you for looking at a 2014 bond. Small school districts tend not to have a lot of assessed value, are dependent upon the state as a partner for their school facility needs. A couple of points. First, As you look at a new program, please keep in mind the Serrano issues that are related to the ability to have access to tax revenues to meet the quality and number of school facilities needed. Your question about the 60% on hardship, one of the reasons for that was to address the Serrano issue on tax rate and tax rate equity. Should it be 80%? Should it be 50%? But it was to address that particular issue.
Wasn't Serrano, Serrano primarily dealt with the educational side of the program, correct?
No. Actually, I read the opinion last week to refresh myself on it, and it has numerous references to the same issues of operational being applied to the facility side. So it was also, although the issue itself and the decision itself dealt with the operational side, if you look at the Judge Jefferson's opinion, it includes basically a conclusion that it would also apply on the facility side.
Well, yeah. I mean, and part of that is because out of your revenue limit and all that also is your money for maintaining your facilities, right?
Well, on the, what it was that you would have equal access to a program for the same tax rate. It was a tax rate issue.
That's right.
And so if you could have a high quality program at 15 cents versus somebody else at $1.50, that was where the issue. That's the same thing if you have a $10 million school.
Well, maybe we can
and we can talk about that
discuss it later, because I
issue.
read Serrano as primarily dealing with the adequacy of the, what I would call the general fund side of it, and not that any of us would agree that some schools, I mean, that districts should ever.
I'd be more than pleased to provide you some of the other pieces off the opinion. But that second is not dealing in silos and looking at this in comprehensive. Thank you for your comments, because your comments were looking at goals. What are the goals of the program? And there are multiple ways of accomplishing goals. And why were certain ways picked? Your discussion on eligibility, tentative track maps. One of the reasons why we have, instead of 3 phases for most people, just 1, and the school district has to upfront the cost of design, upfront the cost of site acquisition, was to put an insurance that the district would only be doing that because of the cost for those schools that they actually knew they were going to need. And so that is the tie to final track map versus tentative track map, that you wouldn't be doing all those upfront costs if you didn't think you would need a school. So looking at that on some of the history of why were some of these provisions placed into law from the old program to the new program in order to address some of these issues.
So can I ask you a question then on that? So just probing a little bit deeper. So you have a situation where a district is preliminary qualified for financial hardship based on your tentative maps and all of that, and now you hit September 2008 and Lehman goes belly up and everything just changes dramatically. What do you do there? I mean, do you go ahead and still fund that school even though the houses may not be built for a decade or the students there for a decade? How would you propose? Do you reduce? How do you deal with that? Because technically, right now, you could keep that eligibility on, and if I'm a district, why would I turn away free money?
Okay, the basic question is, I'm a little bit confused because of the termination of financial hardship, but just on, because most of the time on financial hardship, you're not in that situation. So on the general eligibility issue, if a district had been doing that, had purchased the land and everything else, should it go forward and build? Remember, the district still has to come up with 50% of the match.
I agree with that, but on a financial hardship situation,
I'm not sure how often you would see that situation in a financial hardship situation where the eligibility was off a tentative map and that they did not have the other types of eligibility driving that particular building. And so I'm not sure how often that occurred, but that's an interesting question, one that should be explored, because I don't think any of us want to be spending money for schools that aren't going to be used or filled. The second piece is the operational, because my understanding is CDE is starting the process of looking at the whole school finance process, with their first meeting being November 9th. So there's a conversation between the operational and what you're accomplishing on the facility. And one example of that is deferred maintenance, which is within the operational side, but has a tremendous amount of impact on the facility side. Class size reduction, loading, allocations on programs and types of programs and facilities needed for those types of programs. So just some sort of tie of looking at how that process is going on with what you're doing. And then lastly, to the extent that you can look at program consolidation, we support, as an association, categorical program consolidation. We would think that it would be helpful within the school facility program to have program consolidation to the extent that that's possible, and maybe not have 12 separate programs, as you went through in detail today. So those are some of the points, and would appreciate the opportunity to continue working with you, and to the extent that you can set goals for the new program that allows the different associations, different interest groups, different stakeholders to give you different ways of solving and addressing those goals. There is no one way. There may be multiple ways as you look at all the goals that you have, because there are different ways of addressing lower states downstream costs to addressing what is the amount of funds that are actually needed for a modernization program. Those are not necessarily goals in conflict, but how do you address those in a way that makes sense? So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just have a comment on deferred maintenance. Perhaps we could have a program summary of deferred maintenance as well. It was a program that was operated by the office up until it was flexed for categorical, and I do think it's a very important component of our facilities program and how we are going to invest in maintaining the investments that we made through the $35 billion that we just expended for school facilities.
The question that my bond oversight committee asks me every time we get together: how am I going to maintain what we just spent money on? Kathy Allen, San Juan Unified School District, representing CASH. Thank you for the opportunity to allow a group of people to come and listen to the discussion. I think, first of all, I think this document is totally awesome. I'm going to give it to all my staff. I think several people have mentioned that before. So it's a good compilation of all the programs that are kind of hanging around us right now. I do want to thank Ms. Moore for getting that report going on the Center for Cities and Schools that was completed and shared. It's been a topic of many conversations. We just recently completed the Fall CASH Conference where we spoke about the report, heard about it from both Kathleen and Jeff, and we had a breakout session the last day we were there where we talked about all the stuff that's kind of in here, the different projects that are still open and ongoing, and what we liked about them, what we didn't like about them, what we'd throw out if we could. Can we tweak it a little bit? You know, is there any need to start all over, or can we build on something that has worked in the past? I was mentioning to a colleague in the audience, of all the programs that have been around for a long time, and I guess this does really kind of date me, financial hardship really is the one that hasn't changed very much. And I consider myself fortunate in that I've been able to kind of participate in that program back when I was at a county office of education, but that's probably the one program I think that's stayed relatively the same for the whole time that I've been doing this work. A couple of things I just want to comment on. I think it's a little early to start offering up a whole lot of ideas, and I think as the group goes forward and we hear more things, I think you'll probably hear more people want to come up and share some comments. But several things I heard today that I think resonate with me in particular, mostly because of the district that I'm in, big suburban district with a lot of old schools. Educational program funding versus building funding, or classroom, or per pupil type access. And then the educational modernization, that really rang through to me, because what I find myself struggling with is a whole bunch of older buildings, older schools, using the modernization eligibility that I do have and not being able to alter the facility for an educational program at all. So by the time I get done with that, sometimes you can't even tell I've been there, because it was all underground, or it was all in the roof or in the building envelope, and I didn't even get a chance to change the facilities for the the educational program that might be more valuable today. So, and then under the current program, I wouldn't necessarily be able to go back and do that again for another 20, 25 years. So just kind of another way of looking at that, I think would be beneficial. And then I did write down the maintenance and deferred maintenance because that is such a huge component and will just become more important as we are still allowed to flex Tier 3 dollars, so, or flex it into the Tier 3 account. So I'm very fortunate that my district has not chosen to do that, and we are able to still continue to take care of some of the millions of dollars that we have invested in our school district. So thank you for the opportunity. I think I'll be back up again at another time and share some more thoughts.
If you don't mind, I have a question for her. Just reminded me of another thought. When we talk about some of the sustainability programs, some of the green energy components to education, and we've had discussions, is that really something the state wants to bond out for 30 years when it really helps the operational costs versus the actual physical plant of the building? One of the ideas from a private sector I've been seeing happening, going up to smaller local governments and such, is a company going out and saying, look, we'll offer to replace all your light bulbs with LEDs, we'll upfront the cost, we'll calculate your savings electricity costs, and we'll take half that money back for a period of years. You know, maybe a separate component where we take some of these energy sides of it that really saves the district operations money, which we want to do. I don't want to bond out 30 years and pay interest on it, though. Maybe it could be a loan or lease program where we could front the money, but we get the money paid back into the system, and that's maybe a way to do that, separately from the actual 30-year construction bonds.
Well, in a number of districts, the way they've moved to solar and done others is they enter into power purchase agreements where they use the savings to pay for the solar, and so there are areas like that, I agree, where it's cost neutral to the district, and I'm not sure the state should be funding that, but we could, I think we'll get into that conversation later. Hi.
Good morning, members. I'm Jenny Hanna. I'm from the Kern County Office of Education, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of county offices a little bit, but also districts in our county, and I wanted to address just a couple things. The tentative map, the paper map discussion, I think is really timely. We all know it's different today than it has been in the boom, and that there are a lot of paper maps out there, tracks that aren't necessarily going to develop quickly. What I've seen on the local level is some good leadership and decision making on that. I think I had a district rescind their reservation on funding about 4 months ago because the kids weren't there, and they can't afford to operate or open those schools, and politically, having a new school with no kids is kind of an issue locally. So I'm not sure how that might help balance that equation, but I see that at least in terms of leadership on the local level. Thank you, Ms. Moore, for bringing up county offices and the special students that we educate. We work within this system that's really designed around standard K-12, and we often get left out of the ability to participate in, well, we know we can't participate in career tech necessarily because of some of the education requirements and joint use. So I'd like to see more ability for county offices to be allowed to be more creative with those programs, because I think it would really benefit our student populations. I don't want to get too much in the weeds because I know you guys are going to talk a lot about these things, but as far as the per pupil grant and this idea that building classrooms are what drives the building program, county offices, we have many special needs, medical therapy needs that aren't always tied to building classroom construction. It's still a requirement for us to have those facilities available for the state therapists to provide those services to the children. And, I can't, in this program, I can't build a standalone facility even though I'm required to provide that locally at my level. So there's some disconnects and some pretty big ones that would be nice to have us look at with regard to that. And then just one last comment. I like to pick up on these things and address them, and I think I heard Ms. Moore talk about this. Relocatables is a very broad definition, And I have, I know the ones that I don't like, and I'm not going to say a trade name, but they remind me of trailers. And those definitely don't have the life cycle cost, nor do I agree that I think we should be putting, 30-year money into those type. But there are a lot of other options available to districts now that weren't maybe even 10 years ago that have the life cycle materials and long life to them that happen to be more efficient and cost effective to utilize in a new construction project, much like the Japanese are looking at so much prefab and modular type construction. There's some benefit to that in terms of the cost of erecting a school site. So thank you, and I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Janet Dixon. I'm with the Riverside Unified School District, and I too really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today and the fact that you're looking at this program, hopefully for a new program in 2014. I wanted to speak to one of Ms. Moore's comments about looking at modernization more from a needs-based than simply a per pupil. I echo that. I, like others in the audience, have done many modernizations where we've been able to touch little more than doing ADA access and upgrading fire alarms. And the educational value or needs of the school site have been deferred. And some have been deferred so much that we're actually looking more at a need for reconstruction. There are so many older schools that are so far behind the current standards of today's educational program. And I think one thing that was kind of startling to me, and I think it was to many of you on the board, was a report a few months ago where the federal government looked at schools on bases, and schools that had been modernized under our program were found to be amongst the worst in the United States. And I think that's just a little bit more evidence that the fact that the way we're doing the modernization isn't working. Also wanted to address Assemblymember Hagman and Buchanan's comments about the green program. You addressed the energy component, which is certainly the first thing that everybody thinks of for the high performance grant, but there's a number of other components in there that you're required to meet as well that don't necessarily result in cost savings to the district. Building components that you need to use, location, the facility as far as walkability, things like that. So it's a much broader program than just energy savings. And I'd like to see those additional costs just be rolled into the grant as we're getting green requirements into our building code. It's not really going to be green and not green anymore. It's all going to be one program. So thank you.
Are there any other comments? I think, all of us have commented at various board meetings and on areas we'd like to look into. We've had some comments today, so maybe I'll try and summarize some of it, and you can add in, and then I'll sit down and try and figure out what we can cover in future meetings, because I would imagine some areas are going to be very long discussions and others maybe shorter discussions. But and my pen works and doesn't work. But one area, I know that I've talked about, whatever, is at some point in time we want to talk about eligibility, just in general, right? And then I think probably we're going to want to take some of the major programs, or maybe modernization, new construction, and what I would call other, and have some in-depth discussion, taking a look at, if we talk about new construction, not just the new construction program itself, but talk about in general what falls into all the sub-programs that fall into that, or fall into the modernization. I think I'm hearing that, and I know I have a bias here, but I would like to have part of one meeting dedicated to county offices of education, because clearly they fall into a special category, and we've got to determine how we're going to deal with that. I mean, what is the obligation of the state? What is the obligation of the participating school districts and the SELP or others? But, obviously we have an obligation to educate all of our children. I think we are going to have some discussion on, I guess, as far as what you're calling adequate facilities, because, I think that, to the extent the state should dictate, I'm not sure I agree the state should dictate educational programs, except we do both sort of directly and indirectly through how we fund the program. What's also interesting to me, though, is we don't even have a definition of what a school should be, and I do know it is classroom driven, and I'm sort of not ready to move away from the fact that, kids have a teacher and they go into a classroom and receive instruction, but when we have the grants, when you take a look at the grant amounts, they're really funding at about $300,000 per classroom, and I think we know the average classroom doesn't cost quite that, but that's with the assumption you're going to build so many classrooms, but you also have the office and other buildings that you're building along with that. So I think if we are going to end up at some point in time, another topic talking about grant adequacy and what we want to fund, we should have some idea in terms of what we're trying to fund in terms of a school. And then at some point in time, I think, and that may be closer to the end, but we also are going to have to talk about our priorities. I mean, we're going to have a wish list of maybe, 100 things or 500 things that would be great if we had unlimited resources. But if we're going to have limited resources, we have to ask ourselves, what are our priorities? I know in my district, whenever we had a bond, we said, okay, our priorities are health and safety first. Then we want to be sure we have enough classrooms to house all the students. Then we want to be sure that they're comparable. So if one elementary school has a library or a science center, we want all of our elementary schools to have that. So we need to have, I think, some kind of discussion there in terms of what we can do, because I still believe that the state construction program is there to be a partner to districts. We are not the facilities programs for districts. I mean, schools historically, prior to Prop 13, were funded through local property taxes. The state is not in a position to take that over. So, we need to have that discussion in terms of where we want the state's money to go. So I'm open to other. Are there other areas?
I gave you my pen.
Get your pen back.
No, well, you spoke all that stuff.
That's
You were
right.
supposed to write down each of the components.
Deanna's writing it down for me. I'm okay. Deanna, I asked her if mine was just.
I think we hit most of my goals too. I think looking at new construction in existing schools and then other programs, I think are three benchmarks. I'm more interested in trying to really, I hate to get into the weeds too much, but really understand the cost and comparisons of some of those. And then, we talked about this a long while. Also is technology. How do we integrate that in both now and future? I think that's got to be a must in almost anything we do when we touch facilities anymore. We have to transition, in the next year and a half over to wireless test capability, so we need to have the infrastructure in there. How do we do that? Not doing the 30-year bond out, but just another program. Those are some of the things we talked about, and hopefully there's a whole bunch of notes, and we can organize them into some subgroups and go from there.
I'll go after.
Yes. Just want to thank staff for the good work they did in putting this package together and for the public comments. We do have a pretty complex array of programs, and we've been pretty successful. We put out, $35 billion over the last 14 years. But going forward, I would like us to look more at some program consolidation. I think there's opportunities for that. And probably, more importantly, if we could do some kind of financial assessment of statewide bond capacity. We are at a point where I think in the last year we put out about $1 billion. And we're at a point where debt service, I think, is right about $2 billion. So we're spending more on debt service now than new construction. So a financial component, I think, is critical, and it ties right into prioritizing because we are going to have limited resources.
And we may not know what the public's appetite is for a bond for over a year. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would echo the comment that I believe that we have had an incredibly successful program for the last 12 years, the $35 billion that has been issued and has gone out to do, I think, very good work in communities, and that took all the communities to accomplish. I do believe that we are in a different economic and as well as a different place in California than we were when the program was established with SB 50. So I think it bears that we take a look at what does the future of California look like, both demographically and I think in terms of what our priorities are for education. I echo the comment, I think, by Mr. Walrath that we are glove in hand with the operational side of education, and that that's an important component. So we've had a very successful program. We have a different context of where we are today in California, and I think we also have the opportunity to look at, as you talk about it in priorities, I would use the word goals. What are our goals moving forward? And what are our resources to meet those goals moving forward? And I think that, as the audience has indicated, once that they can have that knowledge of what the general parameter or general goal is, that we'll get a lot more feedback, because then they have a target for the future. This was fabulous information for where we are today. I think what we're trying to look at is where are we going in the future, and in order to do that, I mean, one of the first recommendations of the Center for Cities and Schools report was that the state have a vision and a master plan for facilities, and I think you're talking about the genesis of that. So we would strongly support that. Again, from the Department of Education's vantage point, we're going to look at how is the program supporting quality education in California. So the program driver is important to us, and it's important that our program does not inhibit, that the facilities program does not inhibit good program delivery at the local level. So we'll want to see that incorporated as well. And I think you've touched on those issues.
Right, and it'll be long, in-depth discussion. And I think ultimately, whether it's this committee or we decide to have another subcommittee, we've also had in-depth talks about how do we streamline the program, and that may mean taking an in-depth look at our own regulations to find out how do we make it simple to understand, easy to administer, and we're talking about that already with the audit subcommittee. I want to thank you for all of your work, because I know what a big undertaking this is, and I know that all of you have this information stored somewhere in your brains. I mean, trying to organize it in a way that's easy to understand and provide such a succinct summary takes time, but it is a binder, but it's a very useful binder, and again, I think I agree it should be here. We probably should go ahead and distribute this to the other state allocation board members, and we know we're going to have at least 2 new legislative members coming on board, and it gives you a time where you can sit down for an hour or so and have a great overview of what we're trying to accomplish. So thank you for everything, and then we will sit down and plan future agendas. And what I would ask of all of the members here and anyone in the audience, if there's something that you think of, whether it's this afternoon or tomorrow or down the road that you think we should be looking at, if you would, send me an email, because we can include that when we're discussing that topic area or add it. But we want this to be an inclusive process that ultimately leads to a successful bond in 2014, and I think that the discussions are going to be very worthwhile. With respect to our bonding indebtedness, you're right. I mean, we, in the 1980s, 70s, debt service was about 2% of the general fund. In the 80s, it was 4%. It's over 7% now. Will grow to over 10% if we don't pass another bond. And I actually believe very strongly that school bonds are very appropriate for the state to pass, because education is an arm of state government, not local government, and we do have an obligation to house our children in safe, adequate facilities. But there are going to be challenges going forward, and we're all going to have to prioritize. So thank you very much. We're adjourned. Some of you will see later this afternoon at 2 o'clock.
Can I remind that we have a follow-up meeting on November 28th between 2 and 5?
Okay. And, right.
November 28th. Right.
November 28th. More work to do. And we'll see some of you back here at 2 o'clock, right?
2 or 4?
2.
2.
From 4 to 2.